The Amos Fortune Forum is now in session. Welcome, everybody. This is our seventh and final presentation of the summer. We've had a lot of fun. We've had some light topics, and we have a more serious one tonight, and I can't think of anyone else who's better equipped to talk about it, and I will introduce our speaker in just a moment. To begin, as I normally do, I have a few announcements and thank yous. At the end of the season here, I first want to thank everybody who serves on the Amos Fortune Forum Committee, many of whom are in the room here tonight. We start back in October, thinking about the following summer season. And work very hard to put on this each of the presentations. And this committee makes it an awful lot of fun and not just work. So please give them all a round of applause. You can find their names on the brochures that we sent out, as well as on our website. I'd also like to thank Bob and Diane Schauman for being such gracious hosts for our speaker tonight, took good care of him, fed him a nice meal, and came up with the idea of having Bill here in the first place. So thank you very much. I'd also like to thank George Crawford, who is on our committee for sponsoring the beautiful bouquet of flowers from Calls. Thank you, George. And a special thank you to Betsy Trimble and Jenda Trimble, who have put together the reception, which everyone is invited to immediately after tonight's presentation, just across the way. At the church parish hall. Yes. Not only has Betsy organized the reception tonight, but she sort of took on the whole summer organizing all of them and getting folks to volunteer for it. It's a thankless job, and we really appreciate that she's done it, so thank you. We are recording this. If you have any friends or family who aren't able to make it, or they don't live in the area and they'd like to see tonight's presentation, or if you'd like to watch it again, it should be posted on our YouTube channel by tomorrow afternoon sometime, and it will be there hopefully in perpetuity, or as long as YouTube is in existence. I think that covers most of it. Just one last thank you to all of you who support the forum, our corporate sponsors as well as individuals. I say this each week, but it's incredibly important, and we are very grateful for your generous support. The forum is free. It has always been free and open to all, so everything that you do to support it helps us to be able to put it on year after year, so thank you. And with that, I would like to turn to a more formal introduction. The forum's motto is honoring the past, exploring the future. In that phrase is captured the goal of trying to understand our rich history as the foundation for dialogue and debate about the future. Our speaker tonight is positioned right at the intersection of those two lenses. Bill Gardner was New Hampshire's Secretary of State for nearly 50 years. In that role, he had the unique vantage of meeting with and determining the eligibility of every presidential candidate who hoped to be on the New Hampshire primary, first in the nation ballot, for literally decades and decades. He's also seen what works and what doesn't work with the voting process, and his thoughts on that are central to his presentation this evening. I think we'll probably get a few stories along the way as well. As we have painfully seen over the past decade, our democratic institutions are built on sound principles and institutional norms. However, their strength and resilience derive from the confidence in which citizens believe in them and how those citizens choose to protect them. The activity of choosing who represents us is both vulnerable and what defines us as a democracy. Bill is a New Hampshire native. His parents, his grandparents, and his great-grandparents all lived in New Hampshire. He graduated from the University of New Hampshire and has a Master of Public Administration from Harvard, an honorary doctorate in public service from St. Anselm College. He worked in the New Hampshire State House from 1973 to 2022, serving 3 terms elected to the House of Representatives and 22 terms elected as New Hampshire Secretary of State. He was the youngest and longest-serving New Hampshire Secretary of State since 1680. He was elected by his fellow Secretaries of State to be president of the National Association of Secretaries of State. We are honored here to welcome Bill Gardner to the forum this evening.
Thank you, Bob, Brad, and Bob for hosting us, and Brad. I am truly pleased to be a part of this, what you have here, this Amos Fortune Forum. I was stunned when I walked into this building. Sad that I hadn't seen this years ago. What a place you have here. A truly classic New Hampshire, a product of New Hampshire. And when I saw the sign out front that it said that it was the foundation, you began this or on the day of the Battle of Bunker Hill. And that has so much to do with New Hampshire, because more than half of the men who fought at the Battle of Bunker Hill were from New Hampshire. And I know that for a fact because of the firsthand research that I personally did even before I was Secretary of State during the bicentennial in 1976. So I didn't do Jaffrey because I only did Hillsborough County, which included some of Merrimack County. And I recorded every town and how many men from the town actually went to fight at Bunker Hill. And I'm sure Jaffrey is right up there with Peterborough and Amherst, but I didn't know that. There's a few things that I didn't know until I actually got here. I saw that earlier this summer, some of you were probably here for it, the person who spoke about doing the portrait of Sandra Day O'Connor. She was a good friend of hers, and it was pretty interesting when I saw it, but I couldn't help but think about my personal time with Sandra Day O'Connor. She had been given what was called the Margaret Chase Smith Award. It's an award given once a year to someone who exemplified the courage that Margaret Chase Smith from Maine in the 50s during the McCarthy times. And while she was speaking, Sandra Day O'Connor, for some reason, I was thinking to myself, I wonder what President Ronald Reagan said to her when he talked to her about the fact that he was nominating her for the Supreme Court. So I was determined to get to see her after it was over, and when I approached her, I had a name tag that had New Hampshire on it. And before I said anything, she said, "Oh, you're from New Hampshire. Do you know David Souter?" And I said, "Yes. I was Secretary of State for a couple of years. At the same time, he was Attorney General." "Oh," she said, "I love him so much. He gave so much joy to me. What a person." And I was listening to her, and then I said, yeah, we all think the same about him in New Hampshire. I said, "But I have a question I'd just like to ask you." And certainly. So I said, what was it like when President Reagan was talking to you to become the first woman to serve on the United States Supreme Court? Was there some question in particular that you always remember? And she said, "No." And I said, "No." And she said, I never did get to talk to him." I said, "He never talked to you before or during the time the nomination?" No. And I said, "Well, did anyone from the administration talk to you?" And she said, "Well, yes. She said, Ed Meese talked to me about it, and I was told that President Reagan wanted someone who had been a state legislator." Now, Edward Meese was Ronald Reagan's counselor from 81 until 85. And then he became Attorney General for the rest of Ronald Reagan's presidency. But at the time, in 81, the Attorney General under Ronald Reagan was William Smith from Wilton. I don't know, maybe 20 miles from here, I think, something like that, the way the crow flies. So there's a local connection. And that was just really interesting to me that was the situation. I was like, gee, that's really something. I would have never thought that. Well, I'm here tonight to talk about what is this 60th, this will be our 60th U.S. presidential election. Will it be the last? Now, immediately, you can think, well, that's nonsensical. You can't, that's just not real. That's not a serious thing to say. Well, for 50 years, I was in the State House. The first time, as Brad mentioned, I was there as a representative. I served on the committee that dealt with elections. So I've been, for half a century, following elections very closely in New Hampshire and in the country. And I've talked to a lot of my colleagues about how they do it in their states compared to how we do it in New Hampshire. And at this point in time, unprecedented in modern times, I mean, we did have a serious election problem in the 19th century when there was no such thing as a secret ballot. People would show up at a polling place. They'd have to show what we would refer to as a ticket. Like to get into a movie theater, you have to show your ticket. Well, to get into a polling place, your ticket was your ballot, because the government didn't print the ballot. The parties, sometimes candidates, printed their own. And you would walk in and you would have to show that you had your ticket, which was the ballot that would then go in the box, and then you would leave. Well, people would watch because there was a lot of vote buying. The night before election, candidates, parties would bid up the votes in the towns. And the magazines that were printed in those days, 1850s, 60s, 70s, it was widespread. People estimated 15 to 20% of the votes were actually bought. So it was a serious problem. And the reform was the most successful reform of any election reform in the history of the country. The reform was that the government would print the ballot. No longer did you have to show it, so people, because they would color the ballot or line it so they could see, because they wanted to make sure if they were paying for the vote that the person actually put the ballot that they gave them in the box. Then this reform changed all that. And it was called the Australian ballot. That's why sometimes you might hear the phrase Australian ballots. It simply meant that Australia was the first country to actually do this. And in the United States, in 3 years, between 1889 and 1892, every state in the country adopted this. State, not the federal government stepping in, but the states. And at that time, New Hampshire, for the first time, purchased voting machine boxes. The Secretary of State was required to buy boxes for every town in the state, and the Secretary of State purchased them from a Springfield arsenal in Massachusetts, very sturdy, strong boxes. And those boxes had a machine at the top. The machine actually counted the ballot as it went in, not the votes on the ballot, but counted the fact that it was one ballot and two ballots. Two sizes. One box could hold 999 ballots. A smaller box for small towns could hold 499. And that, we still have some towns that use the box with the machine attached to the top to this day. And we have many towns that still use that box. And that solved a big problem in the country. Well, in modern times now, we're facing different. It is not good at all for a self-governing free society to have the people, we the people, not trusting the process. Trusting our elections is a fundamental reason why we are the longest lasting self-governing free society. Our democratically elected constitutional republic began when New Hampshire, on June 21st, 1788, ratified the proposed new federal constitution 60 miles away from here, north, from where we are tonight, and at that moment made us the United States of America. This republic has continued through 59 presidential elections during some of the darkest hours of our history, including one in the middle of the Civil War. Because the overwhelming majority of we, the people, have trusted the honesty, the fairness and the accuracy of the results of those elections. That's why we have lasted. No one else on our earth has had that kind of free society lasting as long as we have. But the erosion of that confidence and the trust in our electoral process we see today is unprecedented in what we would call our modern times. And so that question tonight, will this 60th upcoming presidential election be the last, is not surrounded by silence anymore. During the last roughly 20 years, this is not something that just began 4 years ago or 8 years ago. And it began because of our federal Congress. How? How did it begin? Because of our federal Congress. It began because in 1993, the Congress, for the first time in our country's history, decided that it was going to impose upon the states rules and regulations for the conduct of how the states qualify their electors, meaning qualify the voters to be able to participate. And it was called the National Voter Registration Act. That act was passed in 1993. Now, you have to separate New Hampshire and two other states, North Dakota and Idaho, from the rest of the country. We in New Hampshire are less than 0.5% of the US population. North Dakota is about half our size. Idaho is about half bigger. The rest of the country is very different. So you who vote in New Hampshire, if you've been voting in New Hampshire all your life and haven't lived anywhere else to vote anywhere else, you have really no idea of what it's like in the rest of the country. The reason that we in those other two states are not like the rest is because when they passed that National Voter Registration Act, they put a provision in it that said that any state that is willing to have voter registration on election day at the polling place, in every polling place in the state, will be exempt from this law. And we ended up, because local supervisors of the checklist, some of you here may be, clerks, moderators, we had regional meetings across the state talking about that federal bill and showing all the things that it was going to require. It was a complete change. It would have been a complete change. New Hampshire has always had a voter registration process that was person to person. So the person would go in, you could ask questions, the supervisors. Every town has 3 elected supervisors. It's their role to simply keep that list. And the clerks only got the ability to do the voter registration after several years after I became Secretary of State. But when they saw what was going to happen, it was virtually unanimous in New Hampshire that we would go to Election Day registration. And we did. But it also said in the law that you had to have it in effect the day the Congress passed it. And we didn't. But we made the law retroactive to that date. And we knew that there was no federal election in between, So no harm, no foul. When we did that, the Idaho Secretary of State called me and he says, I understand you guys have done something. He says, we would like to do the exact same thing. Can you get it to us immediately, the exact wording in your law? So at that time, we didn't have computers, and we faxed it. And so Idaho, within 4 days, passed the exact same thing. So that's how Idaho was won. And the other state, North Dakota, did not have any voter registration. It was a small enough state, people could go in and they would deal with it. So what changed was that now there would be, if we didn't do that, we would have had to have a national voter registration form. People could just mail in their registration, and then they could mail in an absentee ballot, never get to see any person, never get to see a polling place, never. This is the way the rest of the country is. And so the point I'm making is, why half the people now, going back to 2000, roughly 2006, why do half the people in the country feel that elections are not, and whether you use the word honest and open, honest is like fair. Our Constitution says our elections must be free and fair. Free is like open, fair is like honest. There's different words that can be used, but it's the same idea, that elections need to be free and fair, honoring the fact that we are all equal. Our votes count once. The paradox is that we're not all economically equal, but we are all equal. When we stand in line to vote, the richest person in the town can be in front of you, the smartest person can be in back of you, the strongest person can be a couple ahead of you, all kinds of different ways that some people have more than other people. But that vote from those individuals isn't more value. They don't have a higher level, or they don't have 3 votes and you only have 1. That's one of the few things in life, and that's why it's so important to be protecting that, because it is the one thing that we all are equal when we cast our vote. But in the rest of the country now, since that legislation, you can register by mail. Outside groups can register voters. So a very partisan group can go around and collect voter registration cards. And if a person signs up to be a Democrat or a Republican, and they're not Republicans, they may not put the Democrats through, they may just throw it away, which happened for several years. Both sides. So the system was changed in the country, and it was commonly called the motor voter law, because every motor vehicle agency in the country had to now become a voter registration office. And people, when they get their driver's license or their renewals, they become voters. And that created problems and a lot of problems across the country, because people were being registered without realizing they were being registered. I don't know if you remember, a lot of these things don't get publicized in the national news, but in Philadelphia, thousands of voters were found to have been voting for 10 years, none of whom were actually citizens. And when this all came to light, when the first of those appeared in court, what they said to the judge was, well, I never asked to be a voter, but people were calling me and asking me to vote. And I said, but I'm not eligible to be a voter. Oh, yes, you are. Well, why are you saying that? Well, you're on the list. You're on the list. And that's why I voted. And so all of it was thrown out. The judge said you can't criminally charge someone for that. And the Secretary of State of Pennsylvania at that time was someone I knew very well. Secretary of State in Pennsylvania is appointed by the governor. States either have elected by the people, elected by the legislature, or appointed by the governor. And he had to resign because the governor was embarrassed about it. And there was just something a month ago very similar in North Carolina. Well, that law created those situations. And in '93, it became law. It came under the microscope in 2000 when Florida, the mess up in Florida, and what happened in that state. Not only you had the Secretary of State supporting the Republican candidate, the Attorney General supporting the Democratic candidate, but you had people showing up at the polling place believing that they were registered to vote and sent home. And there was an outcry about that. No American should ever show up at a polling place and be sent home if they thought they've registered to vote. Well, what happened was those people, when they were asked, well, you say you're a registered voter. Well, we don't have anything. How did you register? Well, I registered up at Disney World. A person was handing out the forms, and I filled it out, and I gave it back to them. And that was a problem across the country. But Florida, because they had that close election, everybody was paying attention to it. That's when it came to everybody in a much bigger way. And so, what happened? The Congress decides that they have to do something. So they say, okay, we are not going to let this happen again. So we're going to pass a federal law to apply to all states that anyone who shows up at a polling place will be able to vote a ballot. That ballot will be put in an envelope, and they will have 3, 5, 7, 10, some as much as 15 days to cure that. And that, by creating that provisional ballot, we now have elections that are not over on election night. Now, not in New Hampshire. But these things New Hampshire went down the right path in 93 by doing what it did. But across the country, this is the way it is. So the provisional ballots now, that's why this election in November, there could be 25 to 40 congressional districts undecided for a week or two. And the problem with that is that people are not familiar with, well, what happens during those week or two? These ballots that come in, where are they? Who handles them? We have the luxury in New Hampshire, when we go to the polling place, that everyone working in that polling place is voting in that polling place. They're people from, if it's a town, from the town. They have to be from the town. But that's not the way it is across the country. It's rare. In Florida, there's very seldom is anyone who works in a polling place actually living in that polling place. It's just a different way of doing it. And the country is very similar. That's why I'm making the distinction between New Hampshire and the rest of the country, because New Hampshire polls, when people are polled and asked how accurate they believe their votes were counted, New Hampshire's in the upper 90s. Our polls here don't reflect what we see across the country. And it's a problem, a big problem across the country. So in addition to the provisional ballots in the Help America Vote Act, now they've got ballots coming in after the election. And what happened was, in the state of Georgia, they knew that if they had a close election in 2000, they would have been just like Florida, because they had punch cards and everything they saw, people showing up at the polls, not being able to vote. So Georgia decides the law that created the provisional ballots in 2002, the Help America Vote Act, that we were exempt from, again, because we were exempt from the National Voter Registration Act, we became exempt. And it was Senator Judd Gregg and Janet Reno, who was the Attorney General under Bill Clinton, that got us the final exemption, because we had been sued by a community action group in New York City, not anyone from New Hampshire, that they wanted us to fall under motor voter. And they said that they were too late, and this retroactive is ridiculous. And we were headed to lose that case. The judge was Krista McAuliffe's husband, Steve McAuliffe. And I remember in the courtroom, he asked those people from New York City, why are you doing this up here in New Hampshire? What is it to you in New Hampshire? And how can the New Hampshire way of having election day registration be somehow less able for people to vote than what you want in the motor voter law? How can you, and the lawyer for the New York Community Action Group said, Your Honor, it's not about more people voting. That's not where we are. We want to be able to educate voters before they vote. And if we don't know who they are, they can show up at a polling place, then we're not being served the way this law says we should be served. So it looked pretty bad that we were going to lose that case. But Judd Gregg, and it was at the time that Bill Clinton and Newt Gingrich were trying to keep the federal government open. They had those continuing resolutions, and Judd Gregg was able to get a line in that continuing resolution. This is an interesting story for you. So he was able to do it because he had been chair of the committee, an appropriations committee, and Janet Reno was the Attorney General. And when that happened, he called her and he asked her if she would let the president know how she felt about the New Hampshire situation, because she was supportive. And so when it happened, it was on a continuing resolution that President Clinton had said, I'm not signing any more that has anything else on it. I just want a clean one, and we want to be done with this. Well, he ended up getting one additional sentence. And Leon Panetta, who was the chief of staff for President Clinton, this happened on a Friday afternoon. On Saturday morning, when Panetta got the bill, he said, that's it, we're vetoing it. And Judd Gregg picked up the phone, called Janet Reno, and said, you got to help. And she helped with the president, and he said, I'm going to accept that for New Hampshire. So that's how we ended up out of both, because once we got out of the NVRA, the Help America Vote Act, we were out of also. So what else did the Help America Vote Act do? Well, the federal government said, in a few years, we're all going to be voting from home. We're going to be able to vote on our telephones. Where technology is changing so quickly that buy the most modern, state-of-the-art technology. That's what you should do with the $2 billion that we're giving you under the Harvard Act. So Georgia buys these voting machines for every spent almost every cent of its Harvard money, about $60-some million, and bought voting machines that had no paper trail, but they were modern. They were the thing to do. That's what the U.S. Senate members and House members and the commission that was created, the federal commission, as a result of that Help America Vote Act, said. Well, what happened? A lot of people in that first election said, we don't trust this. We don't want any part of this. This is not fair anymore. But they couldn't do anything about it because they had spent all their money. Well, at the second election, critical mass. There were so many people in Georgia. There was a poll done in Georgia. Over 40% of the people in the state said that they didn't want to vote on these machines. And so they had to do something. So Georgia comes up with, you know what? We'll give you your paper ballot, but you're going to have to vote before Election Day, because we're not going to have polling places with machines and polling places with paper ballots being counted. So you've got to vote before Election Day. And so they gave these people multiple days, several weeks before, but they had to do it before Election Day. Well, bingo, what happened? That created early voting. So now we have late voting and we have early voting. Now early voting is a process that a lot of people don't know about. Well, we don't have early voting and we don't have late voting. We don't have late voting in New Hampshire because our Constitution to this day says you have to be present to vote. And it took the people of the state 3 times to vote on a constitutional amendment before they said yes to absentee voting. And that happened at the end of World War II. Before World War II, we had no absentee voting. And it was only for the general election at that time. So the country now has a voting system where voting starts 40 days before an election. Ballots can come in as late as California cannot certify their election until 30 days. California sends a ballot to everybody now. Every registered voter automatically in California gets a primary ballot, gets a general election ballot. And they have multiple days deadlines. Some ballots have to be in 5 days after the election. Some ballots have to be in a week after. Some ballots have to be in 10 days after. Some ballots, they have 15 days to get in after an election. And that has caused a lot of unease in the rest of the country because people don't understand that. What's happening during those days? Who's overseeing the ballots? Compare that to New Hampshire. You get to see the polling place. You get to see the people working there. Now, we have our local issues. There are some people in this town, Jaffrey, has dealt with this more than any other place in the state. For years, you had a resolution at your town meeting to have all ballots counted by hand, have no ballots that are counted by an optical scan device. I understand the argument that people make. Ideally, in the ideal world, I understand it. But our voting machines are not connected to the internet. And they merely count the paper ballot that can be then used at a recount. And every candidate can get to see every single ballot, whether it's at a state recount or a local recount. And so the process is different. But in the rest of the country, it's not like that. So these election bills, starting in '93, the 2 big ones, the Congress had never gotten into that before. Yes, they passed the Hatch Act in 1939, but it wasn't an electoral procedure legislation. And they passed the Federal Election Campaign Act in the 1970s that dealt with financing of campaigns. But the two recent ones, the National Voter Registration Act and the Help America Vote Act, have gotten the federal government much more into this process. And as I said earlier, we're less than 1/2% of the country. California has a very, very different way of voting than we do. They have a primary that results in many instances with only one party on the ballot, because everyone in California gets a ballot, the same ballot, whatever party you are, everyone gets the same ballot in the primary, and the two highest vote getters become the nominee. So when in 2016, when Trump was on the ballot in California, in Los Angeles County has 17 million voters. In most of those ballots, the only Republican on the ballot was Trump, because the U.S. Senate race, Kamala Harris was one, and Linda Chavez, a Democrat from the southern part of California, was the other candidate. There was no Republican in California on the ballot for the U.S. Senate, because the two top vote getters in the primary are the ones that get on the ballot. It's not anything like what we have here. But if we fall under the federal, and the Congress before this one had the For the People Act, and the Congress before that had For the People Act, both were House Resolution 1. Both would have taken over the whole process. And if the process gets taken over, it's going to be states like California that has 53 representatives. That one state, we have 2. And you take all the other states, we have 2 representatives out of 435 in the Congress. It's not going to be our voice. It's not going to be our way of doing it. It's going to be the way of other places. And so the question comes down to, is it a better way the other way? If you look at the turnout in the country, after the 1993 National Voter Registration Act, we've had 7 presidential elections. 6 of those 7 presidential elections have had lower turnouts than the presidential election before the 1993 National Voter Registration Act. If you take a state like Oregon that has no polling places, nobody goes to vote in Oregon. And I was at a meeting up in a small town in northern New Hampshire, and so people were saying, that's not true, that's not true. And then one of the supervisors stood up and said, what he says is true. I've only been here 2 years. I came from Oregon. We don't have any polling places in Oregon. Everyone gets a ballot sent by mail. And when Oregon did that, just before they did it, the Secretary of State of Oregon, at that time, this was in the early 90s, tried to convince me to support mail voting for New Hampshire. He said, if you do it on the East Coast, we're doing it on the West Coast. Within 5 years, the whole country will be doing this, and we will have solved the voting problem. Well, I told them about our tradition here, our towns, and people coming together on that day, and all the reasons that I felt it was more important for us, because we would have more people voting. Well, what happened? I've been through 12 presidential elections as Secretary of State, starting my first year in 1976. 12 presidential elections. The first 5, Oregon had a turnout higher than New Hampshire. And I don't know if we have those. We can get those, that you can see. This is factual. This is all factual. Oregon had a higher turnout than New Hampshire in all 5. When Oregon, from 76 80, 84, 88, and 92. 93 was the federal law. Starting in 96 through 2000, we had 7 presidential elections. The first 5, during the years I was there, Oregon was ahead of us. Every presidential election since Oregon did that, they have been below us. And in some cycles, 10 states below us as far as where they ranked. So this statement, or people being told that mail voting is much easier, yes, it is much easier. But the facts don't show that it actually produces more votes. The facts show that it produces fewer votes. And that's it. And I know it might be startling, because how can you have a process that people are saying, well, how can you ever be against something that makes it easier? How can you be against something that makes it easier? Well, we have the facts now over multiple elections. So there is something going on here cognitively among we the people, because the facts show that it has not made it that more people are voting. So that's the and so what's the result of it? The result of it is an unease in the country. People know that there are people that can register by mail and then vote by mail, never ever seeing a person. We know now there are people in this country that have been on the checklist, not because they ever asked to be on the checklist, but because of the process that was established as part of motor voter. Now, motor voter was done by the Congress because the Congress said it's the government's fault that people aren't voting. The governments across this country have come up with all these difficulties for people to be able to vote. And we've got to fix it. And so they fixed it by doing what they did. Anybody could register by mail, all these groups. You can be on the checklist in more than one place as long as it's in the same congressional district. Federal agencies were given the authority. Any federal agency that provided any type of aid to individuals did become under this federal law. It's not here, but it's the rest of the country. And so all that coming together created this unease, that there's something that's not secure anymore. And that's what has led now, and it started around 2004 after the Help America Vote Act. That's when it began. And I saw it getting more and more. And the computer scientists were telling us, don't have these machines. They're not secure. There's not one that can't be hacked. Across the country, the computer scientists, and they were so frustrated because they said, why are you people doing this? Why are you people doing this? I don't know if you noticed, but just 2 weeks ago, there's an event once a year in Las Vegas called DEF CON, and all the hackers in the country go to it. And they just had one about 2 weeks ago, and some of the reporters that were there asked for a consensus. They said, well, some 20 years ago, you people said that maybe in 20 years it would be safe, but it's not safe now. What do you think now? They had the same answer. They said, well, we think maybe in 20 years from now it might be better. That's what they said just 2-3 weeks ago. Now, these are the experts in computer science that know the most of all of us. The professor at MIT, Ron Rivest, who has the code that's lasted the longest, his textbook on algorithms is the one used across the country. He's helped us a lot in New Hampshire. He's come several times to New Hampshire to talk to people in my office and meet with officials up there. And I happened to meet him in Washington at a panel in 2003 when he said, a panel the federal government put on, there were 4 of us on it, I was one of them, as the election administrator. He was the computer scientists across the country, the top ones, they all had him as their professor because he's just an astonishing person. He's like what you have here, Bob Putnam, in Bob Putnam's own way. Ron Rivest is like a Bob Putnam in his own field and what he does. So that unease of the voting system, not understanding it, and if you don't have paper trails, so states had to make changes, even though the federal government had promoted it, and they had to pay for it. And so, historically, if you go back, even though you can be well-meaning, and how can you argue against someone who's saying, what I'm doing is making it easier for you? How can you be against that? You're a voter suppressor then. That means you want to suppress the vote. And we hear that all the time. New Hampshire, when it gets rated, there's this university in Illinois, every year, every 2 years, just before an election, they put out a ranking of the states. And this has been done 3 elections in a row, and Channel 9 runs with it. This last election, the midterm, it was on the news 3 nights in a row that New Hampshire has one of the worst election systems in the country. Well, if you're going to judge an election system, wouldn't you think that the purpose of an election system is to try to get more people to vote? And the more people that do vote, doesn't that mean something? If you're in a place that votes more than any other place, but these people who think that the process should be different, these professors who say, oh, no, you have to have early voting. Early voting will, or you have to have no-fault absentee. But the facts are not given because the denominators get changed. So if you want to historically go back and look at elections, you use the voting age population because that's the Census Bureau number. And you can't go back beyond 1970 and get what they have now as voter-eligible population. So when you change the way you do the formula, it's just not right. It's not a fair review. And so you don't read about this, but the facts are what I've said. Oregon, 5 presidential elections in a row, higher than us. When they went to all-mail voting and we went to Election Day registration, they had Election Day registration, they got rid of it. 7 presidential elections now in a row, they've been behind us. And that is, that's where we're at. So when I read in the paper about I know that 2 months ago, our vice president was asked, well, is it that serious that this election could be the end of all elections? And she said, yes, absolutely, absolutely. Now, the 2 parties are coming at it for different reasons, but they're coming at it. And if we let it, the truth is important here, and the facts that are truthful are important. And the changing of the denominators is only a way to confuse people. And it's a way not to be able to allow you to go back in the past. And I'll leave you with this one thing. The presidential elections, starting in 1952, 52, 56, 60, 64, and 68. Every one of those presidential elections had a higher turnout than any presidential election that we've had since 1972, except only 3 of them were higher than 2020, because 2020 was a high turnout. And it's typical, looking back historically, in what periods of time in the US were our elections lower. 1948 was the low one. People were feeling good. People had felt good just to be alive because of the struggle of World War II. And people tend not to vote when times are good, when they feel good. And historically, it shows that. And the same thing on the other side. When there's a lot of agitation, when there's a lot of problems, whether it be in the middle of the Depression or the pandemic in the late teens, 1918, and the pandemic at the time in 2020 when we were in the midst of it, that election. So that's my, I'm so glad that and when I was among my colleagues across the country, and I told them about our system, the one thing that some of them said that I understood, they said, well, we can't be like New Hampshire because we're not just 70 miles wide and 180 miles long. We have cities that have 3 million, and my response is, we in New Hampshire are not trying to force you to be like us. We're not doing that. We've never done that. But we would respect you not to try to make us like you. And that's... Okay. So with that, I'm going to I'm so impressed with all of this. And this is, the fundamentally the right way to have. I mean, this is just, I'm surprised that I didn't know before this, over my years, this Amos Fortune Forum. It's just, it's like Bob Putnam said, he found a place in Italy where there was a choral society, and that place had much more civic responsibility than the town next to it. They couldn't figure out why one was so different when they were basically the same people. And he said, the one thing that was different, they had a choral society. Well, you here in Jaffrey this is your choral society. Want me to go down or stay up?
No, you stay right there. Thank you, Bill. I'm so glad we have this choral society here in Jaffrey. That's a lot to chew on. We have a reception right next door. There's nice cold refreshments and some goodies to eat, and that can be our Q&A tonight. You can pick his brain more, so I invite everyone to head over there right now. We do have one last bit of business, and that is to say thank you to Bill with a half gallon of New Hampshire maple syrup.
I'll return.
So we thank him not only for speaking tonight, but for his public service for almost 50 years on behalf of the state of New Hampshire. The Amos Fortune Forum is adjourned.